This is At Your Cervix, the podcast, session 1. Hello, you are listening to the Physio Matters At Your Cervix podcast with pelvic health physiotherapists Emma Brockwell and Gráinne Donnelly. Join us as we lift the lid and bust some myths on all things pelvic health, such as urinary incontinence, pelvic pain and pelvic organ prolapse, issues that are often poorly misunderstood and considered embarrassing and taboo. We'll be bringing you stories from women affected by their pelvic health, as well as talking to some incredible pelvic health geeks. We look forward to being at your cervix and opening up the world of pelvic health to all women, men, and any medical, healthcare, or fitness professionals that work with women. Please remember the information on this podcast is intended as general education and advice only and should not substitute for medical review or assessment by an appropriately trained professional. Join us now as Emma talks to author Luce Brett about her new book, PMSL, that details her personal pelvic health story and the impact her pelvic health had on her physical and mental health. Welcome to episode 1 of At Your Cervix, where we are joined today by author, journalist and blogger Luce Brett, whose new book, PMSL, or How I Literally Pissed Myself Laughing and Survived the Last Taboo to Tell the Tale, is out now. Luce Brett worked in media regulation and as a film journalist and regulator for many years. You'll see the book is peppered with references to the books, films and TV that informed her life, not least her understanding of her own body. She went to Cambridge University from a UK community college school and lives in London with her husband and 2 sons. She became incontinent at 30 years old after the birth of her first son, which kick-started what she describes as a 10-year incontinence odyssey, in which she took a deep dive into some of the most embarrassing, stigmatised and often unmentionable areas of healthcare. She had physiotherapy, operations, various interventions, and suffered from bladder and bowel leaking. And she takes the reader on a visceral, moving, empowering journey through the upsetting experience of embodying one of the last taboos left in healthcare. PMSL is the first book ever written about a subject this difficult in this much detail, and it is a story also about love and resilience. Luce Brett, thank you so much for joining me today. What a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Most welcome. Now, before we get into your 10-year incontinence odyssey, can we talk about life before babies? So your job as a film regulator and journalist sounds fascinating to me. What does that involve, or did it involve?
So when I was a film journalist, my husband's a journalist too, so we met in a newsroom. And I was very early in my career, so I was like always the one who got the, I didn't get to go and see the big blockbusters or anything. I always got the bottom of the pile, but it meant that I developed quite an eclectic and eccentric sort of film canon of my own. So I watched loads of weird and wonderful stuff, which was really good preparation for when I was in my mid-20s and I got my job where I stayed for a long time at the British Board of Film Classification, where my job included giving films the age ratings that you see on the certificate when you watch it, and other things around policy, but also talking to young people and teenagers about how and why films have ratings, why some things are considered harmful or scary or whatever. So it was a fascinating and interesting job, and I stayed there for a long while.
What I want to know is, if they were to turn your book into a film, who would you have play you?
Well, it's a funny one, isn't it? Because I think we all have hopes and dreams. I mean, obviously you'd want like Kate Blanchett, I guess, but I mean,
oh yeah,
I like her. I don't know. I mean, it's got to be someone who's like quite mouthy and sweary. I mean, like, I don't know, Amy Schumer probably strikes me as quite sort of aggy, like I was. But I mean,
she's amazing.
Yeah,
I've enjoyed her. I've enjoyed watching her. Well, her motherhood, her journey through motherhood. Actually, she shows it how it is.
And she's one of those cohorts of American, particularly American, but also I think Australian and some British stars here who are like kind of getting their teeth into it. And again, we can come back to it if there's time, but I love this next generation below us, and like how they're even more furious than I ever was like before it's happened.
But had you, before your pregnancy, when you were younger, ever even thought about pelvic health, pelvic floor exercises? Had that ever come across your path before?
I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what it looked like, and I certainly didn't know that it was like holding my entire life together, which is what I found out to my cost.
Luce isn't alone here. Most women know very little about their pelvic health or their pelvic floor before they fall pregnant. And even when I see them in clinic during their pregnancy, often they're still not doing their pelvic floor exercises. But this is an important point, because should we not be educating women at an earlier age about the importance of their pelvic health? Should we not be encouraging women from their teenage years to be doing their pelvic floor exercises? And in doing so, would we not be destigmatizing and breaking down taboos around this topic, but importantly, also improving the pelvic health of all women? It's food for thought, isn't it? Talk us through the birth of your first child and your postnatal experience. So that's really where your 10-year incontinence odyssey begins.
What I know is that I had what on paper was a normal vaginal birth, a spontaneous vaginal delivery. I went into labour. It was just under 20 hours. I started off quite quickly, and then my son was back to back, so there was a lot of talk of turning, and then for various reasons the sort of middle 12 hours were quite tricky, because there wasn't space on labour ward. I was taken out of labour ward again and put on another ward. My husband was sent home, so I felt very lonely and afraid, and I think that I wasn't in a very good place by the time I actually got to the sort of flesh and bones of childbirth, shall we say. So he was born without intervention, although it was on the clock, so there was quite a long pushing stage, and there was a lot of talk of a von Tus or a possible cesarean. So I remember by the time he was born, there were lots of people around and gloved hands touching me and stuff, and somebody told me that they were going, she went in, I mean, I saw the scissors, she went in for an episiotomy, and then she said she didn't have to do one because I'd already torn enough. Go me. Great. But there was only, I mean, and this is not, I don't blame anyone, and I'm not cross with anyone about that, although I was upset for a long time. But you know, there was only one person using my name in that room, so I did what she said, and she was a student midwife, and I think she sort of saved me, but at the same time I think we were both kind of novices that night, and but she was the one who I could feel, because her hands on my thighs, you know, she was the one talking to me, who I listened to, because everybody else was just sort of shouting around me. And you know what it's like, you're lying down, so you just can't tell who's there. Anyway, so he's born to a beautiful July morning. I had stitches. It was only a second degree tear, although I've had people query that various times, although I think that it's been pretty much established it was second degree. Of course, you have no idea, do you? Partly because I hadn't really checked before, so I didn't know what it was supposed to look like. So my knowledge of what I looked like afterwards, you know, I chose the wrong moment in my life to get to know my anatomy. I chose the bit where it probably wasn't as fresh and lovely as it could have been.
This is a great comment made by Luce. She hadn't looked at her vulva before pregnancy or childbirth, so she never knew what her baseline was, what her normal was. I see this in clinic all the time. Women do not look at their vulvas. I would encourage every woman to look at their vulvas at least once a month. Get to know what's normal for you, because by knowing your normal helps you understand your body that much better and allows you to flag something when something doesn't seem right.
I do remember one of that they brought lots of students in to watch the woman stitch me up, who they also wheeled in as there was talk about whether it be her or a doctor, and it turned out they chose this experienced midwife, and she got a lot of compliments actually over my entire journey, because she did a very nice job. So,
oh, wonderful.
Yes, but so I'm grateful to her. But anyway, yes, so I was stitched up, went home. I was still quite dazed and stressed, and over that first few weeks a number of things happened. So I leaked, I thought, probably a lot of urine, partly from the way it was stinging when with all my pads and things post baby, but I didn't really have a reference point for how the lochia works. And then quite soon, within a week or so, well, maybe that's quite a long time, I don't know really actually about postnatal, what's normal, but anyway, I had quite a big hemorrhage at home and I had to go back into hospital, and that happened 3 times because we didn't end up with a DMV for various reasons that are actually quite hard to piece together now, but along the lines of, we would have the scans and they would say it's pretty much all gone, and then it would happen again. So there was something about clotting, and I talk about them quite frankly, and I did at the time, but what I never addressed at first was how traumatic that was, because it meant like lots of rummaging and people checking speculums and things, and you've just had a baby, the last thing you want is like another speculum examination. But what I mean for the pelvic floor stuff is that it meant I wasn't quite sure like what I was feeling, and whether that was right or not. So there was a lot of people saying things and me thinking like that didn't hurt as much as they seemed to think it was, or them saying I was being brave when I couldn't feel things and stuff. And obviously I think I found out later, the first time I actually saw a pelvic health physio, that I had quite a lot of nerve damage and things, but I didn't know that. So I kept saying, I think I'm leaking lots of wee, and people kept sort of saying, it'll calm down, you've had a horrible shock, it's been really difficult, like nobody wants to have like 3 hemorrhages is such a lot, like it's really quite tricky. And so both my mental health and my physical health, it sounds like people were really minimizing it, and that really wasn't the intention, and I didn't even feel like that at the time, but they were kind of basically going, the fact that you're holding it all together is great, like you'll get there, you'll do this, it's okay. And so I sort of carried on and you know, tried to get involved in all the baby yoga and all that stuff with my NCT friends, but I really got the impression that I was probably leaking a lot more, and like still very birthy and postnatally down there, and well across my body really, but that's quite hard to talk about because you're like mates you've met at the hospital antenatal class or whatever, they've all just had a baby too, so like we were all new at it, so we were just kind of fumbling together trying to help each other, and so it really wasn't until like my 6-week check, which was actually delayed obviously because of all the hemorrhages and had to be at the hospital rather than with my GP, it was only then that I sort of got to talk about it, and I didn't have the words, Emma. I didn't have the experience to know. So I look back, and what I was trying to, I think, express was that there was probable nerve damage, that I didn't, that I couldn't envisage how sex would ever work again, and anything close to that. Because I've been very disingenuously told that you should have sex before your 6-week check, and which, I mean, yeah. I mean, I think less said about that sort of particular escapade in our marriage is the better, but certainly what I realised was everything wasn't the same, and it wasn't very helpful. And then
oh my goodness, also, so you had sex despite going through all of that, you still did it because you thought it ticked a box before your GP check.
What I'm told.
Oh so, god.
But yeah, I know. But yeah, and also because you've just made a baby, haven't you? So that's also not talked about. Like, you do sort of want to like closeness with your partner if things are okay, and things were awful, and we were kind of clinging to each other, I think, in a way at that time. But yeah, so there's all this leaking, and I just kept thinking, like, I remember like thinking, is this really it? Like, is this what is everybody walking around like this? Like, what a complete and utter crock of shit are women putting up with? And I sort of couldn't believe it. That's what I mean about those sort of new celebrities now, who sort of seem to be articulating that much more forcefully, because I was kind of shell-shocked. And yeah, so then I went and saw someone, and when she did examine me, so at first we went through all the motions of a 6-week check, and I mean, like, my son was fine. He was like signed off by the midwife in like 5 minutes with his like snarly face, so beautiful but so angry, and like constantly taking his socks off so old women would tell me off in the street and all that stuff. And then I've got this woman, she does it, and she talks to me, and like I say, she wasn't rude or tick boxy like that. I don't mean that. I just mean that those boxes, they don't really resonate. So we got to the end, and she sort of said something about like sort of, is there anything else? And I brought up weeing a lot again, And she again said it's very normal, especially breastfeeding, like some exercises, you know, have you thought about doing a pelvic floors whenever you get to a traffic light, and or when you do something you do every day, like washing up? And I remember thinking, like, isn't life crap when you're a mum if like those are the highlights of your day? Brilliant. For a start, you know, can't I just be like eating ice cream and watching Grey's Anatomy all day or something rather than washing up? But also that it didn't make any sense to me. Like I was like, what do you mean? What do I do when I'm washing up? I squeeze. What happens if I can't feel it? And what do you mean about lifting a lid, lift and stopping at every other floor? I don't know what that means, and I can't feel it, and it all feels very wrong down there. And I'm getting through loads and loads of like tenor ladies, and all the old pads that I had from when before I was pregnant that were in the bathroom and all that stuff. And I don't, this cannot be normal, and if it is, I want a bloody refund. And she said, well, what makes you leak? And I remember saying that, everything. And she sort of stopped, and she sort of simultaneously did the kind of one of the, you know, was the start of some exceptional care I've had, and also like I think the kind of face that you all know well of her thinking, like, you know, it's like 4 o'clock or whatever it was on a bank holiday Friday, like seriously. And anyway, so she re-examined me, and she found that I did in fact have prolapse that she could see moving, and she thought that there was probably some nerve damage, and that I was actually leaking a lot. When she did a much more sort of thorough cough now, lifting her legs sort of stuff. I remember just before she did it, she said, you're not going to like this. And I remember thinking, like, what the hell's she going to say? And is she, you know, and she's so she's going to sound pregnant again or something. And she said, cough. And I sort of went, and she was like, you can do better than that. And I thought, oh God, like, because like, and she was like, I know, because she knew
you were holding back.
Yeah, and she knew that I knew what would happen. And yeah, because that's very scary, because it's like admitting everything and showing everything. And I was like, I'm going to cough and it's going to like spurt everywhere, and then what are we going to do? And that's quite scary. I think it's easy to forget that all those things that we wouldn't want to do in front of our boss or in front of a first date, just because someone's a doctor or a physio, it doesn't mean you want to fight in front of them. And it's like, have the dignity or not. But yeah, so that's how it started, and she sort of saw it all, and then she sort of put me through for birth trauma counselling, thank goodness, and also some physio help. And that was the start of my like sort of physio journey, and the first time someone went, yeah, right, okay, there's a real problem here. And
I ask what impact urinary incontinence and prolapse at this stage, before we get on to the second stage, what impact did that have on your physical and your mental health?
Well, it was really intense and really difficult. And so there's several factors. There's the kind of drudge and the boredom of it. There's the mental exhaustion, because it's such hard work, like leaking all the time. And I remember like sort of almost immediately from that physio, I was sort of counting down in my head when we would get back to work, and her saying like it might take 4 to 6 months or whatever she said, thinking, is that going to be enough time? Will I be dry when I get back to work? What will it be like? Bladder retraining was very, very stressful, because a lot of the discussions of that is kind of based on a presumption, I think, because of I don't know, like as if you've not got a job or you've not got a life. And I remember sort of saying like, and she said, what's the worst thing that, you know, if you wet yourself, you just have to let, you know, you can't run for the loo. And I was just thinking, well, it's all right to say that, but it's very different when you're standing in Sainsbury's, like, really? And will I ruin the whole thing if I don't embrace just standing and wetting myself in the pavement or whatever? And so there's all that kind of stuff going on. But, you know, I felt disgusting. I felt physically uncomfortable. It was expensive. I had to be really resilient in a way that probably has helped me, but has a tremendous cost, because I look back at her and she's like 31 and she's had this really terrible birth, maybe 30, 31. And actually I feel quite sorry for that woman, because she, you know, took a deep breath and went and bought several sets of black leggings from Sainsbury's, and went and bought like clothes that weren't exactly what she wanted to wear, were a bit maternity leave-ish, because she knew that way she could take spare clothes to work, and she couldn't talk about that with her friends. And, you know, that was hard. And I think, you know, it was difficult and it was embarrassing, and it felt like a problem for much older women as well. So people were so kind, but there was so much of like, oh, my nan has that, or my grandma has that, or my auntie has that, and that sounds like I'm being rude about that, because people were very, very kind and sympathetic, especially the sort of people I told about it. But it was harder. I got a lot of solace at that time from speaking to women online, like anonymously on it wasn't actually Mumsnet, but on a similar sort of forum, and yeah, that was very helpful, because it is very isolating. But one thing I would say, and because I want it to be reiterated really, if there was sort of, one of the reasons I wrote the book was the sort of transformative moment that I found this out, and the shock I had that no one had said anything. Nobody ever linked my depression to incontinence, which meant I just blamed myself. I thought it was my fault and I hadn't coped with it well enough, and everybody else, it must be something that most people just glide through. And as it turns out, that doesn't seem to be the case, because when you write a book about something like this, people start telling you their stories, and I started to hear women who sounded exactly like me, and then halfway through the story you realise that they were describing themselves at 30 in the 1970s, you know. And so that it has always been quite tricky, especially, you know, I have a really good relationship with my mum, but she doesn't live nearby, and she was very young when I was born, so she was still working full time. She wasn't, you know, there was no like sort of grandma 3 streets away who I could speak to or anything like that. And my sisters are much younger than me, so they hadn't had babies, they were teenagers, and so I felt totally alone.
Yeah, and the research shows clearly the strong link between urinary incontinence and depression, mental health, and yet it was really you that put the link together when you were talking to other healthcare professionals, and suddenly the penny dropped. Oh, hang on, the reason I feel like this is largely because I'm leaking, and it's making me feel awful. So I'd love to say the story ends there, but it continues. You went on to have your second baby 3 years later.
Yeah.
3 years later. And your symptoms were a lot better, but they hadn't completely resolved by the time you fell pregnant again. How well did you recover from your second pregnancy and childbirth?
Well, first of all, I leaked almost immediately. That I weed on a pregnancy test, and I didn't stop weeing from there was a lot of leaking in pregnancy quite quickly, so it was almost like a switch, like it just stopped working. I still don't know, you know, maybe there's a psychological element of that, I don't know. And I had quite serious antenatal depression because I was so terrified of birth and the aftermath and what might happen. Again, quite understandably, I think. And yes, I got some good care that acknowledged that. And then I had a birth, and it was very quick, precipitous birth, completely different to the other one. And he and I were sick of being pregnant by that point, because I'd also had quite serious, it was called symphysis pubis dysfunction, I think.
Yeah, or pelvic girdle pain is what it's called now, yeah. To add to this, some women develop pelvic girdle pain during pregnancy. Symptoms can commonly be felt over the pubic bone, at the front and centre, across one or both sides of the lower back, sometimes in between the vaginal and perineal area, and the pain can spread to the thighs as well. For some women, it can be incredibly debilitating, as Luce continues to tell us.
And so I was on, I mean, like, that was really bad. Like, I was on crutches and stuff, so I couldn't, we have a terrace house, so I couldn't go upstairs to the toilet and stuff, or whatever. It was a nightmare. I had to like wee in the garden in a bucket.
Oh,
It was hideous. But that also didn't help, because like once that happened, I was just like, it was all gone. Like, I had no pelvic muscle control tool. The tablets they give you constipation. It was just a nightmare. So by the time my son was born, it was like, really was like, he and I had just had enough. So it took about 20 minutes to emerge, and like 20 hours. And he was great, but my pelvic floor was not great, and that was immediate. And actually, when I described things like I had the first time, clearly I had a lot more clarity or whatever, but they didn't go like, oh, it's fine. They were like, you know, I practically had the letter in my hands to go to a physio within minutes of giving birth. Anyway, she was great, and I loved her, and she was really, really helpful to me for many, many years. And we worked together really hard, and she was, straightforward, kind. She helped. She understood how rubbish it was. She started to help me see the links with depression, I think, and she understood that I could cope with a level of evidence-based stuff, so when we showed things like that. The trickiness with our relationship was, and looking back, it's like looking back on like a love relationship that's gone wrong. Like, there was definitely a few sessions towards the end where she was trying to sort of shift what I was thinking. And first of all, she showed me we talked about pessaries and things like that, and I remember feeling like really brave and opening it and like almost reacting like those boys back in my sex education class. I said, I can't look at that. I cannot look at like some sort of synthetic plastic tampon that looks like a space shuttle. I'm not like, no, okay. And she was like, okay, so that's not where we are, you know, like, so I can't. And anyway, over those last couple of sessions, she said that she thought we'd come to a point where we should look at next steps. And like you said, I felt that I had let her down by not doing it, but also, I mean, I was genuinely terrified because I thought it felt like she was dumping me, and I thought, if I leave this room, there won't be anybody who knows about all of this who I can talk to, and I'll be, oh look, it's making me cry.
Oh, sorry, Luce.
On my own. No, but it was an interesting thing because I didn't realise it would be like that, and I think she didn't either. And I think that's not talked about with stigmatised conditions enough, or maybe it is, and I've just not seen it. But I suspect for a lot of patients, sometimes that's the only place where they've admitted stuff.
Yeah. And
the thought of losing that is terrifying. And she was like, you know, we can move on to a multidisciplinary team. And now I know what that all means. But at the time it was like, what's that? Who else is going to look at my skirt? Who else is there? Are they going to be nice, or are they going to be horrible? Will they use my name? Who are they? What do they mean? What do they want to do? And also, you know, like, oh my God, like, what would an operation there look like? What would it feel like? Do I want that? You know? And so it was very emotional and difficult, that sort of transition to different sort of care.
Where you'd have seen more doctors and nurses, really. So you come away from the physio, and you would also see a consultant gynecologist to explore less conservative options, perhaps.
That's right. And it's interesting though, because one thing I thought it made me feel very reassured in lots of ways was that it was clear from the way she was talking that she was on that team, or
we're part of that, absolutely.
And she'd done a lot of work about my case, so when I met them, they knew about me, and it, you know, they have over the sort of since that point, over surgeries and things, you know, I have been sent back, if you like, but you know, I have had physio intervention at other points, and they were really great. But it was a big wrench to leave physio, because I think I just can't believe I'm alone, because I think that once you get over that sort of first examination and the exercises and everything, you know, once that's done, like, you're like on fourth date territory, aren't you? So this is a very intimate relationship you have with someone, and unlike almost all other medical relationships, it's always with the same person.
Yeah.
And that makes a massive difference, because they know about you. And I know that that's true widely with physio, because I have arthritis as well, and I've had similar things with that, where in some ways I was having, you know, super duper care from like consultants and people in different hospitals, because I have an inflammatory form of arthritis that when it was being diagnosed, but the person who held it together was a physiotherapist, because it was him who I saw every 6 weeks, and him who in many ways was noticing other clinical signs that they weren't noticing. So he was noticing when I lost lots of weight, for example. And it was the same with the physios with pelvic floor, that they were people who had this idea of me as a person. And I think that that's quite a compelling thing in healthcare.
Yeah, we're really lucky, I think, with our job, because you really get to know the person. It becomes more than just a symptom, and it should never just be that you're treating the symptom. But when you are seeing a patient for 10 minutes, that sometimes is all that can be looked at. But we get to know our patients really, really very well, and not just what concerning them, how their day was, how much their kids have been annoying them. You know, it's everything. And then to suddenly feel that potentially that relationship stopped, it, especially when you're at your lowest ebb, that's a huge wrench, isn't it? I know you didn't stop with physio after that point once you'd seen the consultant, but being there at that moment, it must have been hugely overwhelming. And I think we underestimate the importance of that relationship as well.
Yeah, and the value. I mean, I also think that it puts physios in quite an interesting situation, a bit like some community midwives with home birth teams and stuff, because like you say, like what seems very trivial, someone like moaning about their kids, the same person coming back 4 weeks later and not mentioning their kids or saying anything is a very different prospect. Whereas, you know, if you're some poor beleaguered I don't know, locum GP, you have no idea if this woman's surly or if she's having a nervous breakdown.
Yes.
And whereas
yeah.
You know, insight, but yeah, no. So that it was really reassuring that she was part of that decision making.
Yeah.
Very helpful about it, and of course I had physio intervention after I had my surgeries and things as well. So they came and helped me with everything. So yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, because that's what happened next, really, wasn't it? You saw your consultant, Mr. Wazwizard, who clearly isn't his name, but a genius nickname, and Carol, the continence nurse, as well. She was continence nurse.
Yeah,
am I right there? And developed, you know, you speak really fondly of them in the book, and he's almost a little bit of the hero of the book, isn't he? You know, he sounds fantastic. But you collectively, this wasn't just you and him making this decision. I think collectively as a team, you decided that the best option to help your symptoms would be surgery, which isn't a decision that's taken lightly at all. How did you feel about making that decision? Because I believe it was at a time when gynecological surgery was being heavily questioned, rightly so, by women who had experienced having mesh implants being used to help their symptoms, and actually resulted with a lot of these women really sadly developing severe pelvic pain and inability to have sex, didn't help their symptoms, and also led to lots of disabilities. And so you were about to have surgery at a time when all of that was really coming to light more so than ever.
Yeah, I mean, so they did various tests as well, like sort of urodynamics and all that stuff. And then two things happened. So the mesh stuff was beginning. It wasn't like it is now. It was definitely beginning though. It was definitely around. And it was still the gold standard though.
Right.
Those two things were true. But
okay.
the Wazwizard was very clear that from my history and the level of incontinence that I was experienced, which after urodynamics he described as off the scale, he was basically incredulous that I hadn't like immediately demanded surgery. And he was very clear that he felt the more invasive cold-pressed suspension was a much better option for me, partly because, you know, the adage, or, you know, sort of the first surgery is your best shot at it working, and that he felt actually given situation, given how many years of physio I'd had, and that it hadn't got me to a point, but it never got me further. That and I was compliant, you know, I did do all the stuff, and yeah, he felt that we should go in with that. So I wasn't even offered the mesh, in fact, at the time. And I mean, it feels very awkward to say this now, and it's not about diminishing, but it's about how complex being a patient in these difficult worlds is. You know, I felt quite jealous of women offered the mesh because they had a couple of weeks off work. The women I knew at that point who had the mesh had amazing stories of recovery. So the few people I knew actually had a really good experience on it. Actually now, of those women, some of them have developed those symptoms, so that's not the case. But right at the time, it felt like once again I was getting the crappiest deal, because I had to do this like hideous surgery that would take ages, and there were slight complications afterwards, not really big ones, but I ended up, like, you know, with like a bag for a week and all that sort of disgusting stuff. Gross. And I found all that really, really overwhelming, to sort of go from being someone who was like leaking and quite depressed about it to somebody who couldn't walk properly and had like a wee bag and everything straight afterwards. But yeah, we recovered, and and that helped quite a bit. But the sort of laxative things came back. I ended up with faecal incontinence, which nobody talks about, and which I didn't know how to talk about when it happened, but I knew I had to, because it's one of the questions people always ask you, and I had been so pleased to be able to say no when people ask me about that. It's a bit like with postnatal depression, like they always ask you if you want to hurt your baby, and I never did, and so it's almost like a relief to be able to sort of say no, not him, it's not his fault. And it was the same sort of feeling of relief that I had when they'd be like, and have you had any bowel leakage? Like, no. So when it happened, it was pretty dreadful. And so yeah, it wasn't actually connected to, it happened after the first operation, but it wasn't connected to, I mean, we did lots of tests. I went back to see them, you know, the Wesley, and they were massively helpful, and we went through everything. It wasn't that, it was just about laxity, I think. I think I just sort of
so the fecal incontinence wasn't as a result of the surgery. It happened because of connective tissue, your tissues, basically, because you're hypermobile as well, aren't you? But the fecal incontinence was a different ball game, right? On the impact it had on you, because tell us, what impact does fecal incontinence have on you?
Well, it is the worst, I think. Although the book I talk a lot about, the end of the book is a lot about like how we think about all these things, and it did feel like the worst, and that I don't blame myself for thinking that, because that is the stigma. And if you look at research, there's horrendous research about how much people don't want to be fecally incontinent, and we know how people are treated the globe over and throughout history, and it's really difficult, because it's also like, it's disgusting and it smells, and makes a little bit of wee look like a walk in the park. Like, wee doesn't even smell at first. Like, if you wet yourself in a meeting at work, if you can get out to the toilet quite quickly, you can use water and wipe it up. If you're wearing black leggings, people might not even notice. Like, you can get away with it. You can't get away with fecal incontinence. You can't get away with it. It's disgusting. It makes a mess. It's expensive because you have to throw knickers away and things like that. And it's got all the other stuff that incontinence has. It makes you feel like a toddler. It makes you feel completely out of control. It's deeply unsexy. I mean, and all those things. So it was really difficult, and it did feel like sort of poisonous cherry on the top of a pretty poisonous.
Of course.
But on the good news, there was lots of help.
Right.
Take it very seriously. I hadn't realised that, like, even more so, I would say, than urinary incontinence.
Yeah.
And there was stuff that could be done. And I think because I was like in this sort of multidisciplinary team environment by then, a specialist environment at the hospital, I was incredibly fortunate, because sort of from the get-go, instead of being someone who this happens and you speak to your GP for a bit and then you get in, you meet people you've never known and stuff. These were people who knew me quite well, who I'd had surgery with relatively recently, and who I'd had a long physio relationship with. So we did do a lot of things that I guess were easier for me than a lot of patients. I think I was very fortunate compared to a lot of patients in that situation, because I did have Carol, who could talk to me about bum tampons and had developed enough of a relationship with me to know, like, when I was really laughing or when I was about to burst into tears, and what it would mean. And also it was quite interesting, because I also had lots of questions about it, and she was one of those, the continence nurse and that team really were all quite good at saying things like, I don't know, I'm going to go and find out, or like, so I was saying, like, could you use those bottom tampons to stop leaking during sex, or was that unsafe? And she was like, because nobody's ever asked that before, so let me try. And so there was a lot of those sorts of things that we went through together that were really useful, really useful. But it's a funny world, you know. Went back to my GP, she'd never seen bottom tampons, she didn't know about them, and she's a really great GP, but what I mean is, it's
untalked about, isn't it? And those questions,
surgery people don't talk about it.
Yeah.
Going on have got it, you know, they're being treated for it, they come in about it, but they can't talk, and that is really difficult. I can't imagine how hard that must be. So at least I was in a situation where I kind of had already left my dignity at the door like 8 years ago or whatever. So, and I was with people who I felt very safe there at the Urogynae clinic. I think also around, it's a very obviously delicate subject, but given I've written a book about it, like, here goes. I think that a lot of clinicians who aren't intimately involved in this sort of pelvic physio world, not you know, obviously there are specialities that are really great, and there are individuals that are great, and probably training schemes that are great, but there are, in my experience, enough to mention it, people who are not very good or comfortable about talking about sex with a patient, even when I think it is very, very important. And I think that going back to like my original birth, I think that there wasn't enough talk around sex then. I think I think they left me very much on my own to work out what I could or couldn't do, and I think that added another level of pressure, which contributed to all sorts of things going down. And I can see why it would impact on marriages and partnerships and stuff. If you can't tell your husband and wife about it, you can't do that. And I really, you know, I had people say things and they were trying to be helpful and kind, and so I can't be angry because people are trying to be kind with them, but I can be angry, I think, with a general way we think about women and sex. And so, for example, this was not uncommon. More than one person said to me, well, your husband still loves you, doesn't he? You had the second baby, he doesn't mind that much. And I remember thinking like, oh, okay, so if my husband doesn't mind that I poo and wet myself, what am I, just a hole? Like, should there be no part of his attraction which is about wanting me to be happy? Is it really unreasonable for me to not want to be dirty and disgusting and to not feel like I can't leave the house? Like, is that okay? What sort of husband do you think I've got if I'm afraid to sleep with him in case I mess the bed, but he doesn't care? Like, what? Like, and they didn't mean that. They didn't mean that it would be okay if you were in a relationship that was really abusive or coercive, or your husband didn't care about you, or your wife didn't care about you, or whatever. They didn't mean that. But that is the sort of thing people say around sex and pelvic problems. And I just think, I think that there's a really big part of learning, and maybe that's because patients don't talk about it either, so you never ever get the thing. So it's patients who do say something who end up like having to hold all the complexities, because the person who said, one of the people who said that kind of like, your husband loves you, I think it was a learning point for both of us, me, that I couldn't necessarily always carry the weight of like medical care that doesn't quite get difficult subjects, because I think that happens a lot with continence, because you're left on your own so much. If you don't have a great pelvic physio, if you don't have a great continence nurse, if you don't have that sort of stuff, that's the stories I'm hearing when having the book, is that people haven't got all that, or they're seeing a physio who doesn't specialize in that. And I think it is dirty and disgusting, and it is difficult, and it is a fine line, because if you destigmatize too much, if you say, oh, don't worry, I've seen it all before, then you know, the patient might, I was thinking, well, you haven't seen mine. Like, you know, it's a very intimate thing. It's really weird mixture of perfunctory and intimate and all that, but it does warrant a bit of thought, because I think that could massively improve care, especially, like I say, outside. So this podcast is not just for people who work in pelvic physios, it's for everyone. And I think sort of, but it is a difficult area, but it is so linked right back to what we said at the beginning. Your pelvic floor contains so much of your life, your like social confidence, sexual function and pleasure and confidence, and your views about fertility, all these things, and that is, if that gets messed up, then that's a very difficult place to be. And I think patients do need quite a lot of help with that. They may not want it. I mean, I don't know. I think some patients wouldn't want to talk about that, but it is worth making it something that is possible for the patient to talk about, because I felt like I had to be quite brave sometimes to bring that sort of stuff up, and I'm not sure that's making the incontinence person have to be the brave one. It's like giving them a punishment for having a stigmatized condition, and they've got enough to do, because they've got to make sure that they've got like extra pairs of black knickers in a size bigger, because otherwise they cave and or not, depending on which pads they're using that day. And they have to remember which pads are stronger and which aren't, and which ones work better for wee, and what to put in their handbag and what to carry every day, and whether if they're going to the physio their t-shirt will be too long so they'll wee on it, and that's a lot to think about every single day, and that they can't be late for anything because they can't run. You can't make them like run continence care as well, or
No.
the hardest things, because they're pretty tired and stressed by the time they get to you, probably.
Such a good point. And we do need to be better at screening. We do need to be better at opening up the conversation and lifting the lid, and not not looking like we're bothered to talk about it. I mean, in my consultations, talk about everything. And I think that's because I am comfortable talking about those things, but I also, perhaps because I've experienced myself some pelvic health issues, perhaps I'm aware that I need to bring these things up, because if I've suffered them, there's every reason you're going to have suffered them, and the value in being able to talk about those, and the validation that brings as well. So
yeah, because even if your patient doesn't want to talk about it, if you ask them about their sex life, you're acknowledging that it's okay for them to have concerns around that relating to continence. They might not want to talk to you about them. I mean, certainly the first time someone asked me, I said no, like, yeah, it's fine, it's fine, because I wasn't ready, whatever. But I think because I had really good pelvic care from the start, and from the start of my issues as well, so I hadn't got embedded personal habits of coping with it in quite the same way as a lot of women, if they're taking 7 years, 10 years to come and get help for fecal incontinence or whatever it is, they fecal leaking in sex and stuff, that people don't bring those up straight away. Because I went quite quickly, I did, that very first physio experience, she by bringing those sorts of things up, I knew in my head that I was allowed to ask about them. I'm not sure lots of women or men do. I don't know how, if they feel that that's there, and they should, because it's massively important. It's
a huge key physical function, and it's an everyday it's an everyday activity that we should be talking about, as much as can you run around, can you get on the trampoline. It's essential to your relationship, it's essential to your well-being, and it is essential that we are bringing it up, but also to highlight that if you are having issues with any sexual dysfunction, that you do speak to a healthcare provider about it, because we are used to hearing about it, we are very happy to talk about it, and we do have many solutions and many treatments that will help with that as well. If we haven't been clear, given everything you've been through, what advice would you give to someone who's listening to this and thinks they might be incontinent? What would be your key 3 tips, perhaps?
Remember that you're not on your own, because it's easy to lose your nerve when you think you're the only one. That's not true. There's absolutely loads of help possible. There's loads and loads and loads that you can do, but also, like, be kind to yourself, because you can't do it all at once. It's okay if you can only manage to wear some pads for now, but be kind to yourself. If they're uncomfortable, try a different brand, they might work better. If you can just ring your GP, that's okay. Just have one conversation, ask them about referrals, ask them for some options, and then go away and think about it. You don't have to do it all today, because we're really lucky. We don't have to, like, on Call the Midwife, use a potato to hold our prolapse up. That's not how it is anymore. You don't have to put up and shut up, but you also don't have to become an incontinence warrior overnight either. There's loads there. That's what I would say.
Amazing. Luce Brett, thank you so much. Your book is outstanding. Every single woman should read this book, and every single healthcare and fitness professional should read this book, because it's incredible and witty and emotive, and it's a bestseller on Amazon. So congratulations, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
A huge thank you to Luce for joining me on At Your Cervix, the podcast. Her story really goes to show what an impact pelvic floor dysfunction can have on someone's physical and mental health. Pelvic floor dysfunction continues to be shrouded in taboo and stigma, but the more it's discussed and stories like this are told and heard, the closer we get to breaking down these barriers. If you're suffering from pelvic floor dysfunction, including urinary incontinence, fecal incontinence, or pelvic organ prolapse, remember there is help available. Speak to your GP and ask for a referral to a pelvic health physiotherapist who you can see via the NHS or privately. I'd highly recommend anyone listening to this podcast today to read Lucy's book, PMSL. It's available to buy now on Amazon. On next month's session, Gráinne interviews exercise physiologist and performance and nutrition coach Joe O'Connor and the Olympic athlete that he trains, mother of 3, marathon runner Lizzie Lee. Tune in as they will discuss all things postnatal pelvic health in high performance athletes.
Thank you for listening to the Physio Matters at Your Cervix podcast with pelvic health physiotherapists Emma Brockwell and Gráinne Donnelly. We look forward to bringing you more interesting and relevant content to lift the lid on all things pelvic health. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode. We welcome any questions, comments or suggestions about the show by emailing atyourcervix@physio-matters.com. You can also find us on all social media channels including Twitter, Instagram and Facebook by searching for @yourcervix-the podcast.